She was 8 months pregnant, sitting in a courthouse, signing divorce papers. Her husband's family had laughed at her father's funeral just days before, called him worthless, called her nothing, mocked her tears in front of everyone. And her husband? He smiled as he signed the papers, told her she'd leave with nothing. His mother announced it to the entire hallway. No money, no rights, nothing. They thought they'd won. But then the judge paused, held up a sealed envelope, her father's will. And when she opened it and started reading, the room went dead silent. Because the man they mocked, the father they called a failure, had been hiding something they never saw coming. And everything they thought they owned, everything they'd used to control her, belonged to her now. What she did next didn't involve shouting, didn't involve threats, just cold, calculated decisions that dismantled them piece by piece. This is the story of the woman they tried to erase, and the silent revenge that crushed them forever. Before we dive into the story, I need to be honest with you. It took weeks to research and write this story to make sure every detail hit exactly right. If you're already hooked and want to see how this plays out, the least you could do is hit that subscribe button. It's free, it takes 1 second, and it tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's get into what happened next. Alara Vance had believed in second chances the way some people believed in miracles, desperately, quietly, against all evidence. The iron gates of the Hale estate opened before her like the jaws of something ancient and patient, and she stepped through them carrying nothing but a small suitcase, and the kind of hope that comes from having no other choice. The mansion rose ahead, stone and glass and centuries of accumulated power, its windows catching the late afternoon sun in a way that made them look less like windows and more like eyes. She had been inside once before, 3 weeks ago, for the wedding that Rowan's family had attended with the enthusiasm of pallbearers at a funeral they hadn't been invited to. But this was different. This time, she wasn't a guest. This time, she was expected to stay. The gravel crunched under her shoes, each step a small announcement of her arrival, and Alara found herself counting them, a nervous habit from childhood that her mother had tried and failed to break. 1, 2, 3, 4. Rowan had promised her that his family would warm to her, that all they needed was time, that love could soften even the sharpest edges. She had wanted to believe him. She had needed to believe him. Because the alternative, that she had married into a family that saw her as an intruder, a mistake, something to be tolerated at best and erased at worst, was too terrifying to consider. So she had practiced her smile in the mirror that morning, rehearsed small talk in her head, and told herself that patience and kindness were not weaknesses, but strategies, tools she could use to carve out a place in this world that had no room for her. The door opened before she reached it. Maribel Hale stood in the threshold, perfectly still, her posture so precise it looked rehearsed. She was smaller than Alara remembered, but there was nothing diminished about her. She occupied space the way certain people occupied conversations, completely, without apology, as though the world had been built around her and everyone else was simply visiting. Her eyes moved over Alara with the clinical efficiency of an appraiser evaluating merchandise, lingering on the modest dress Alara had chosen because it was the nicest thing she owned, the shoes she had polished twice that morning, the suitcase that bore the scars of a dozen moves before this one. The silence stretched. Alara felt her pulse in her throat. Then Maribel spoke, and her voice was silk wrapped around steel. "You're here." It wasn't a greeting. It was an observation, delivered with a kind of neutrality that made it impossible to tell whether she was pleased or disappointed or simply resigned to an inconvenience she couldn't avoid. Alara forced her lips into something that might pass for a smile. "Yes, Mrs. Hale. Thank you for welcoming me into your home." Maribel's mouth curved at the edges, a movement so slight it could have been imagined, and when she replied her tone had shifted just enough to carry a warning. "I hope your upbringing has instilled the manners and discretion our household requires." The words landed softly, but Alara felt them like a slap. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Maribel stepped aside with a gesture that was less invitation and more command. The interior of the house swallowed her whole. Marble floors stretched in every direction, reflecting the light from a chandelier that hung overhead like a frozen explosion of crystal. The walls were lined with portraits, men and women in clothing from another century, their faces severe and unsmiling, their eyes following her as she passed. The air smelled expensive, polished wood, fresh flowers, something faintly floral that she couldn't name, but knew cost more than she made in a month. Everything gleamed. Everything was perfect. And Alara, standing in the center of it all with her scuffed suitcase and second-hand dress, felt like a stain on an otherwise flawless canvas. Maribel led her down a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. Rowan will be home later. He's attending to business matters. She didn't look back as she spoke, didn't slow her pace, didn't offer any further explanation. In the meantime, I'll show you around and explain how things work here. She stopped abruptly, turning to face Alara with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step back. You must understand, Alara, that this family has certain standards. We have a reputation to uphold. Everyone who lives under this roof is expected to contribute to that reputation. She paused, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, calculated, as though she were waiting to see if Alara would crack under the weight of it. Do you understand? Alara's throat felt tight, but she managed to speak. Yes, Mrs. Ale. I understand. Maribel studied her for another moment, her gaze unblinking, then nodded once and continued walking. Good. You'll find that we are a close family. We value loyalty, discretion, and above all, respect for tradition. She said the word tradition was sacred, like it carried the weight of commandments carved in stone. I assume Rowan has told you about our expectations? He hadn't. Not really. Rowan had spoken in vague, reassuring generalities, promises that his family would come around, that they just needed time, that love was enough. But love, Alara was beginning to realize, was not a currency that held value here. She chose her words carefully, aware that every sentence she spoke was being measured, catalogued, and filed away for future judgment. He mentioned that family is very important to you. Maribel stopped again, this time in front of a door, and turned to face her fully. Her expression was unreadable, a mask so carefully constructed that Alara couldn't tell what lay beneath it. Family is everything, Alara. But not just any family. Our family. The Hale name carries weight in this city, and we will not allow it to be tarnished by carelessness or poor judgment. The pause that followed was deliberate, designed to let the threat settle. I trust you won't disappoint us. Before Alara could respond, the door behind them opened and two women entered, younger than Maribel, but carrying the same air of entitlement, the same effortless cruelty that came from never having been told no. Rowan's sisters. They stopped when they saw Alara, and their eyes narrowed in perfect unison, predators recognizing prey. The taller one spoke first, her voice light and mocking. So this is her. The one Rowan couldn't stop talking about. The shorter one tilted her head, studying Alara with a kind of curiosity reserved for insects under glass. She's smaller than I expected. I thought she'd be more impressive. Alara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that bullies fed on reaction, that silence was sometimes the only weapon available to the powerless. So she stood there, hands clasped in front of her, and said nothing. Maribel stepped between them, her presence commanding immediate attention. Girls, this is Alara. She's family now, whether we like it or not. The words were meant to sound welcoming, but the emphasis on whether we like it or not stripped away any pretense of warmth. Show some manners. The sisters exchanged glances, their smirks fading slightly, but not disappearing. Of course, mother, the taller one said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Welcome to the family, Alara. The shorter one echoed her, the words identical, but somehow even less sincere. Yes, welcome. They left without waiting for a response, their laughter echoing down the hallway like the sound of breaking glass. Ilara stood frozen, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. This wasn't the family Rowan had described. This wasn't the warm, loving home he had promised. This was something else. Something colder. Something designed to break her. Maribel turned back to her, and for just a moment, Ilara thought she saw something flicker in the older woman's eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication. "Don't mind them," Maribel said, though her tone suggested she didn't care whether Ilara minded or not. "They'll warm up to you eventually. Or they won't. Either way, you'll learn your place here." She continued walking, and Ilara followed, each step heavier than the last, each breath harder to draw. She had come here believing that love could bridge any gap, that patience and kindness could soften even the hardest hearts. But now, surrounded by marble and malice, she wondered if she had been wrong. And if she had been wrong about that, what else had she been wrong about? The question followed her through the house, down corridors that all looked the same, past rooms filled with furniture she was afraid to touch. And when Maribel finally left her alone in a bedroom that was beautiful and empty and felt nothing like home, Ilara sat on the edge of the bed and realized that she had just stepped into a war she didn't know how to fight. The first dinner came 3 days after Ilara arrived, and she had spent those 3 days learning the house the way a prisoner learns the layout of a cell, carefully, quietly, committing every detail to memory because survival depended on it. She had unpacked her small suitcase, hung her clothes in a closet larger than her childhood bedroom, and tried to make herself invisible. Rowan had been distant, distracted, offering her quick smiles and vague reassurances before disappearing into his study, or leaving for meetings that always seemed more important than the wife he had just brought home. Maribel had been cordial but cold, issuing instructions disguised as suggestions, corrections wrapped in politeness. And the sisters, whose names Ilara had learned were Victoria and Celeste, had ignored her entirely, which somehow felt worse than their earlier mockery. But the dinner was different. The dinner was a test, and Ilara knew at the moment Maribel informed her that the extended family would be attending. She chose her outfit with the care of someone preparing for battle, settling on a simple navy dress that was elegant without being flashy, modest without being dowdy. She arrived in the dining room early, hoping to make herself useful, to prove that she belonged here even if no one believed it yet. The table was already set, crystal glasses gleaming under the chandelier, silverware arranged with military precision. Ilara counted 12 place settings and felt her stomach tighten. 12 people, all of whom would be watching her, judging her, measuring her against a standard she didn't understand and couldn't meet. She took her seat where Maribel had indicated, at the far end of the table, and waited. They arrived in waves, aunts and uncles and cousins, whose names blurred together, all of them dressed in the kind of casual elegance that came from old money and older traditions. They greeted Maribel with warmth, Rowan with affection, and Ilara with polite nods that felt more like dismissals. She smiled, shook hands when offered, and tried to ignore the way they looked at her. Quick, assessing glances that lingered just long enough to communicate disapproval before moving on. Rowan sat at the opposite end of the table, too far away to offer support, and when their eyes met across the distance, he gave her a small, encouraging smile that did nothing to calm the knot of anxiety in her chest. The meal began with small talk, light conversation about weather and travel plans, and mutual acquaintances Ilara had never heard of. She listened, contributing nothing, aware that silence was safer than saying the wrong thing. Then the wine came, a bottle so old the label had faded, and Maribel gestured for Ilara to pour. It was a simple request, delivered with a smile, but Ilara felt the weight of it immediately. Every eye at the table turned to watch as she stood, lifted the bottle with hands that trembled slightly, and began to fill the glasses. She moved carefully, precisely, aware that one mistake would be remembered forever. And then, just as she reached Maribel's glass, the older woman leaned close and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't spill it this time, Ilara. Remember, appearances are everything." The words hit her like a slap. This time, as though she had spilled wine before, as though she had already failed in ways Ilara couldn't remember or defend against. The laughter that followed was polite, almost gentle, but it carried an edge that made it clear this wasn't kindness. This was a correction. This was a reminder that she was being watched, that every mistake would be catalogued, that she existed here on borrowed time and borrowed goodwill. Alara's cheeks burned, but she kept her hand steady, finished pouring, and returned to her seat without a word. Across the table, Rowan said nothing. He didn't defend her, didn't correct his mother, didn't even meet her eyes. He just sipped his wine and continued his conversation as though nothing had happened. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of subtle cruelties. Victoria commented on Alara's dress, noting that it was charming in a quaint sort of way, which everyone understood meant cheap. Celeste asked about Alara's parents, her tone dripping with false sympathy as she referred to them as simple people who had done their best despite limited means. An uncle whose name Alara had already forgotten made a joke about Rowan marrying down, and the table erupted in laughter that felt like knives. Each comment was delivered with a smile, wrapped in politeness, designed to wound without leaving visible scars. And Alara sat through it all, her face a careful mask of composure, her hands folded in her lap, her mind cataloging every insult, every sneer, every moment of deliberate humiliation. When the dinner finally ended and the guests began to leave, Alara excused herself and retreated to the bedroom. She closed the door, locked it, and stood in the center of the room for a long moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then she crossed to the small desk in the corner, pulled out a notebook she had brought from home, and began to write. She documented everything, the comments, the looks, the tone of voice Maribel had used when she delivered that first correction. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the rage and humiliation had been transformed into something concrete, something she could hold on to. Because Alara understood something that the Hale family didn't. She understood that cruelty left evidence, that patterns could be tracked, that patience was not the same as weakness. And if they wanted to test her, if they wanted to see how far they could push before she broke, then she would let them. But she would remember every single things. The corrections came faster after that first dinner. Victoria and Celeste made it their mission to catalog her every misstep, whispering loudly enough for her to hear whenever she adjusted her napkin wrong, laughed too loudly, or spoke out of turn. They began spreading rumors, subtle at first, suggesting that Alara had trapped Rowan with the pregnancy, that she was calculating and manipulative, that her kindness was a performance designed to secure a place in the family fortune. The rumors spread through social circles like wildfire, and soon Alara found herself excluded from events she had been invited to, frozen out of conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. Her friends, the few she had managed to make in the brief time before the wedding, stopped returning her calls. Later, she would discover that Victoria had contacted them personally, suggesting that Alara was too busy adjusting to her new life to maintain old relationships, a polite way of saying she was no longer available to people who didn't meet the Hale family standards. The financial control came next, so subtle she almost didn't notice it at first. Invitations to corporate events, where she might have met potential allies or expanded her understanding of the business world, were rescinded without explanation. Rowan would mention them casually, almost apologetically, explaining that the events were too formal or not appropriate for someone in her condition. Her phone began disappearing at odd times, usually during family gatherings, only to reappear hours later with no explanation. When she asked about it, Maribel smiled and suggested that Alara was simply misplacing things, that pregnancy did strange things to a woman's memory. The implication was clear. She was unreliable, forgetful, not to be trusted with important matters. And slowly, methodically, they began to isolate her from anything that might give her independence or influence. Rowan's transformation was the most painful part. The man who had courted her with flowers and promises, who had sworn that his family would love her as much as he did, began to pull away. He stopped asking about her day, stopped seeking her out when he came home from work, stopped defending her when his family made their little corrections. At first, Alara thought she was imagining it, that she was being too sensitive, that the stress of adjusting to her new life was making her paranoid. But then came the night she tried to talk to him about it, tried to explain how isolated she felt, how cruel his family was being. He had listened with the patience of someone humoring a child, then told her she was overreacting, that his family was simply traditional, that she needed to be more understanding of their ways. "They're not trying to hurt you, Alara," he said, his voice tired and dismissive. "They're trying to help you fit in. If you would just try a little harder, be a little more flexible, this would be easier for everyone." And in that moment, Alara realized that Rowan had never intended to defend her. He had brought her into this house not as a partner, but as a project, something to be molded and shaped until she fit the image his family required. And if she couldn't be molded, if she refused to break, then she would simply be erased. That night, alone in the bedroom while Rowan slept in his study, Alara added another entry to her notebook. She documented the conversation, the tone of his voice, the exact words he had used to dismiss her pain. And then she made a decision. She would not fight back. Not yet. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break, would not provide them with evidence that she was emotional or unstable or unfit for their world. Instead, she would endure. She would observe. She would document every slight, every insult, every calculated act of cruelty. Because Alara understood something that the Hale family, in all their arrogance and privilege, had never learned. She understood that cruelty was a weapon that could be turned against those who wielded it, that patience was not surrender but strategy, and that the person who appeared weakest often held the most power. They thought they were teaching her her place. But what they were really doing was teaching her how to destroy them. The weeks that followed the first dinner blurred together in a pattern of calculated cruelty that Alara came to recognize the way sailors recognize storms, by the shift in air pressure, the darkening of the sky, the feeling in her bones that something terrible was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her friends stopped calling entirely. Sarah, who had been her closest confidant since college, sent a brief text saying she thought it was best if they took a break from their friendship, that she didn't want to complicate Alara's new life. Emma, who had promised to visit every week, stopped responding to messages altogether. It wasn't until Alara overheard Victoria on the phone, her voice sweet and poisonous, that she understood what had happened. "Oh, I'm sure Alara would love to see you, but she's just so overwhelmed right now. The pregnancy, the adjustment to our family's expectations. It's all been quite difficult for her. Perhaps it's better if we give her some space." The lie was delivered with such practiced sincerity that Alara almost believed it herself. Almost. The phone disappearances became more frequent, more brazen. During family gatherings, Alara would set it down to help serve dinner or clear plates, and when she returned it would be gone, only to reappear hours later in places she knew she hadn't left it, tucked under a cushion, placed on a bookshelf, once even found in the kitchen trash beneath a pile of discarded napkins. When she mentioned it to Rowan, he sighed with the exhaustion of someone who had been asked the same question too many times. "You're probably just forgetting where you put it. Pregnancy does that, you know. Mom said her memory was terrible when she was carrying me." The dismissal stung worse than the theft itself because it meant he was either blind to what was happening or complicit in it, and Alara wasn't sure which possibility frightened her more. The exclusion from corporate events was framed as protection, as though they were doing her a favor by keeping her away from the very spaces where she might have found allies or built connections. "These events are so tedious, darling," Maribel said one afternoon, her tone dripping with false concern. "All those stuffy businessmen talking about numbers and acquisitions. It would be terribly boring for you, and besides, you need your rest. The baby comes first, doesn't it?" But Alara had seen the invitations, had heard Rowan discussing the events with his sisters, had watched Victoria and Celeste prepare for galas and board meetings, wearing designer gowns and confidence like armor. She understood what was really being said, that she was an embarrassment, that her presence would damage the family's reputation, that she was being hidden away like a shameful secret no one wanted to acknowledge. The family gatherings became performances of psychological torture, so refined they could have been taught in textbooks. Alara was ordered to serve food while everyone else sat, forbidden to join conversations even when they concerned her directly, scolded if she spoke without being spoken to first. At one gathering, an elderly aunt asked Alara about her parents, and before she could answer, Maribel cut in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alara's family is very humble. Simple people, really. They did what they could with limited means." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and the aunt nodded sympathetically, as though Alara's background was a tragedy to be pitied rather than a history to be respected. Alara wanted to scream that her father had worked 2 jobs to put her through school, that her mother had taught her the value of dignity and kindness, that humbleness didn't mean worthless. But she said nothing. She had learned that defending herself only gave them more ammunition, more proof that she was sensitive, emotional, unsuited for their world. Victoria and Celeste escalated their campaign with the precision of generals executing a battle plan. They began posting on social media subtle digs wrapped in compliments that their followers would recognize as insults even if Alara couldn't prove it. So inspired by women who marry for love, not security, Victoria wrote beneath a photo of herself at a charity gala, the implication so obvious that Alara's phone buzzed with messages from acquaintances asking if everything was okay. Celeste was even more direct, posting a throwback photo of Rowan with an ex-girlfriend captioning it, "Remember when Rowan dated women who actually understood our world?" The comments that followed were vicious, strangers speculating about Alara's motives, her character, her worth. And when Alara confronted Celeste about it, the younger woman just laughed. "Oh, don't be so sensitive. It's just social media. If you can't handle a little teasing, how are you going to handle being part of this family?" But Alara could handle it. She handled it by documenting everything. Every cruel comment, every manufactured rumor, every deliberate act of exclusion went into her notebook, recorded with the date, the time, the witnesses present. She had filled 3 notebooks by now, their pages dense with evidence that she kept hidden in a locked drawer in the bedroom. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with this information, wasn't sure if it would ever matter. But the act of recording it gave her a sense of control in a situation designed to strip her of all power. And late at night, when the house was quiet and Rowan was asleep in his study, and the baby kicked inside her like a reminder that she had to keep going, Alara would read through her notes and feel something harden inside her chest. Not anger, exactly. Not hatred. Something colder. Something patient. Something that understood that justice delayed was not justice denied. Only justice waiting for the right moment. The worst part wasn't the cruelty itself, but the way it was framed as care. When Maribel confiscated her phone during a family dinner, she did it with a concerned smile, saying, "You've been so stressed lately, dear. I think you need a break from all that technology. Just for tonight. Just so you can be present with us." When Victoria suggested that Alara shouldn't attend Rowan's company anniversary party, she positioned it as practical advice. "You're showing now, and you know how people talk. It's better if you stay home, rest, and take care of yourself. We're thinking of you." The gaslighting was so skillful that Alara sometimes caught herself wondering if she was the problem, if she was being too sensitive, if her inability to accept their help was the real issue. But then she would remember the laughter at her father's funeral, the mockery in Maribel's voice when she called him useless, and the doubt would evaporate, replaced by a clarity so sharp it cut. The household management fell entirely on Alara's shoulders despite her pregnancy, despite her isolation, despite the fact that the family had a full staff of housekeepers and assistants. When Rowan's grandmother fell ill, it was Alara who coordinated the medical appointments, who sat with the old woman through long nights in the hospital, who paid the bills when the insurance didn't cover everything. When a pipe burst in one of the guest bathrooms, flooding 2 rooms, it was Alara who called the contractors, supervised the repairs, and ensured that everything was restored before the family noticed. But her efforts were never acknowledged. Instead, they were reframed as manipulation, as though she were doing these things not out of kindness, but as part of some calculated plan to ingratiate herself. "She's trying so hard to make herself indispensable," she heard Victoria say to Celeste one afternoon, their voices carrying through the hallway. "It's almost sad, really. As if any of this will matter when Rowan finally realizes his mistake." Rowan's betrayal deepened with each passing week. He no longer defended her, no longer even pretended to notice when his family humiliated her. At a board meeting she had been allowed to attend, only because several members had specifically requested her presence. Rowan dismissed her suggestions without consideration, talking over her as though she hadn't spoken. Later, when she tried to discuss it with him, he accused her of being too emotional, of taking business too personally. You have to understand, Alara, these people respect strength. If you come across as fragile or overly sensitive, they won't take you seriously. But she hadn't been fragile. She had been competent, prepared, and articulate. And he had undermined her anyway, because in Rowan's world, supporting his wife meant challenging his family, and challenging his family was unthinkable. One night, 6 months into her marriage and 5 months into her pregnancy, Alara stood in the bathroom staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked thinner, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her hair pulled back in a style that Maribel had suggested was more appropriate for someone in her position. She barely recognized herself. The woman who had walked through those iron gates with hope and determination had been systematically dismantled piece by piece, until all that remained was this hollow shell going through the motions of a life that felt less like a marriage and more like a sentence. But beneath that exhaustion, beneath that hollow feeling, something else was growing. Something patient and deliberate and absolutely unbreakable. They thought they were teaching her her place. They thought they were breaking her spirit. But what they were really doing was teaching her exactly who they were, exactly how they operated, exactly where their weaknesses lay. And when the time came, and Alara knew it would come, she would use that knowledge in ways they couldn't imagine. For now, she would endure. She would observe. She would survive. Because survival, she was learning, was the first step toward something far more powerful than revenge. It was the first step toward justice. The call came at 3 a.m, the kind of call that shatters sleep and replaces it with a cold certainty that everything has changed. Alara's father had collapsed at home, her mother's voice breaking through the phone with words that came too fast and made no sense until they did. Heart attack, ambulance, hospital, come now. She was dressed and moving toward the door before her mind fully processed what was happening, her hands shaking as she searched for her purse, her keys, her phone. Rowan stirred in the bed they no longer shared most nights, his voice thick with sleep. "Where are you going?" She didn't have time to explain, didn't have the energy to ask for his support. So she just said, "My father. Hospital. I have to go." And she left, driving through empty streets with tears streaming down her face and her father's laughter echoing in her memory. The way he used to call her his little fighter. The way he taught her that dignity wasn't something people gave you, but something you carried inside yourself no matter what the world tried to take. He died before she arrived. The doctors said it was quick, that he hadn't suffered. But those words meant nothing to Alara as she stood in the sterile hospital corridor, staring at a door she couldn't bring herself to open. Her mother found her there 20 minutes later, and they held each other in silence because there were no words big enough to fill the space her father had left behind. The funeral was arranged quickly, a small service at the church where her parents had been married, where Alara had been baptized, where her father had sung in the choir every Sunday for 30 years. She called Rowan from the hospital, her voice barely above a whisper, and told him when and where. He said he would be there. He said his family would come to pay their respects. And Alara, exhausted and grief-stricken and 7 months pregnant, believed him because she needed to believe that even the Hales had limits to their cruelty. She was wrong. They arrived late, disrupting the service, as they filed into the back pew with expressions that ranged from bored to actively hostile. Maribel wore black, but it was the black of a woman attending a fashion show, not a funeral. Designer dress, expensive jewelry, heels that clicked against the church floor like judgments. Victoria and Celeste whispered to each other throughout the eulogy, their voices just loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough to be called out. And Rowan sat beside his mother, his face carefully neutral, offering Alara nothing. No comfort, no acknowledgement, no sign that the woman standing at the pulpit talking about her father's kindness and integrity was his wife, carrying his child, drowning in grief. But it was after the service, at the small gathering at her mother's house, that the true horror unfolded. Alara had prepared simple food, coffee, and sandwiches, and the kind of modest comfort that her father would have appreciated. The Hales stood in the corner like visiting dignitaries, slumming in a neighborhood beneath their station, and Alara could feel their judgment in the way they looked at the worn furniture, the faded photographs on the walls, the humble home that had been filled with more love than the Hale mansion would ever know. Then Maribel started talking, her voice carrying across the small living room with the confidence of someone who believed she had every right to say whatever she pleased. "It's such a shame," she said to an aunt whose name Elara couldn't remember. "The man worked his whole life and left nothing behind. No legacy, no accomplishments, nothing of value. Just emptiness." The word hung in the air like poison, and Elara felt something break inside her chest. Before she could respond, before she could defend her father's memory, Victoria joined in with a laugh that was meant to sound sympathetic, but came out cruel. "At least he doesn't have to worry about money anymore. That's one burden lifted, right?" Celeste nodded, adding, "Though I suppose Elara will be fine now that she's married into our family. Silver lining and all that." They were laughing. At her father's funeral, in her mother's home, they were laughing. And Rowan said nothing. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to speak, not uncomfortable enough to defend the man whose daughter he had married, the man who had raised the woman carrying his child. The silence was its own form of violence, and Elara felt it cut deeper than any of their words ever could. She excused herself before she said something she couldn't take back, before the rage building in her chest exploded into something that would give them exactly what they wanted. Proof that she was emotional, unstable, unfit for their world. She locked herself in her childhood bedroom, the same room where she had dreamed of a future that looked nothing like this, and she cried until there were no tears left. Her mother found her there an hour later, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed against her swollen belly, and when their eyes met, no words were needed. Her mother had seen everything, had heard everything, and the look on her face, equal parts fury and heartbreak, told Elara that she understood exactly what kind of family her daughter had married into. The divorce demand came 3 days after the funeral. Elara was still staying at her mother's house, unable to face returning to the Hale estate, unable to sleep in a bed that belonged to a man who had shown her nothing but contempt during the worst week of her life. Rowan called first, his voice tight with the kind of anger that comes from being told what to do. "We need to talk. About us. About the future." She agreed to meet him, hoping against hope that he was calling to apologize, to explain, to somehow make sense of the nightmare her life had become. Instead, he showed up with papers. Divorce papers. Already prepared, already signed on his end, waiting only for her signature to make it official. "My mother thinks this is for the best," he said, as though that explained everything, as though his mother's opinion was more important than his wife's grief or his unborn child's future. "This marriage isn't working, Elara. You have to see that. You don't fit in with my family, you never have, and I can't keep pretending that love is enough to fix that." His words were rehearsed, delivered with the mechanical precision of someone repeating lines he'd been fed. Elara stared at him, this man she had married with such hope, such belief in the possibility of change, and realized that she had never really known him at all. "I just buried my father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you're asking me for a divorce." Rowan had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to change his mind. "I know the timing isn't ideal, but waiting won't make this easier. We can do this quietly, civilly. You'll be taken care of, within reason. But the child," he paused, and Elara felt ice flood her veins. "The child won't carry the Hale name. My mother has made that very clear. She should have expected it, should have known that even this, even the innocent life growing inside her, would be weaponized and controlled and stripped of dignity." But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing Rowan deliver the message with the emotional investment of someone reading a grocery list, broke something in Elara that she hadn't known could break. "Get out," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "Take your papers and get out of my mother's house." He left without argument, without apology, without even a backward glance. And Elara sat in the living room where they had mourned her father 3 days ago, and understood that she had reached the bottom of a pit she hadn't known she was falling into. But Rowan and his family weren't satisfied with private humiliation. They wanted a public execution, a spectacle that would cement their narrative and erase any doubt about who held power in this relationship. The courthouse was Maribel's idea, a calculated choice designed to maximize shame. Rowan filed the papers officially, and Alara received a summons to appear for what was supposed to be a routine procedural hearing. She arrived alone, 8 months pregnant now, her body heavy with exhaustion and grief, wearing the only dress that still fit. The Hales were already there, a united front of expensive suits and cold smiles, occupying the hallway like conquerors claiming territory. Maribel saw her first and made sure everyone else did too, her voice projecting across the corridor with theatrical precision. There she is, the girl who thought she could trap my son with a pregnancy and a sad story. Well, today she learns that this family doesn't negotiate with opportunists. The words were meant to wound, and they did. But what hurt worse was the crowd that had gathered, other people waiting for their own hearings, court staff, lawyers, strangers who would never know Alara's side of the story, but would walk away with Maribel's version imprinted in their minds. Victoria stepped forward, her smile sharp enough to cut. "Don't worry, Alara. I'm sure you'll land on your feet. Women like you always do. You'll find another man to support you, another family to latch onto. It's what you're good at." Celeste laughed, the sound high and cruel, and added, "Just make sure the next one isn't smart enough to see through you." Rowan stood behind his mother and sisters, and when Alara's eyes found him, she saw nothing there. No guilt, no regret, no recognition of the woman he had promised to love and protect. He was a stranger, and worse, he was a coward, and she understood in that moment that whatever happened next, she would face it alone. The bailiff called them into the courtroom, and Alara walked through the doors with her head up and her hand steady, even though her heart was breaking and her mind was screaming, and every instinct told her to run. Inside, Rowan signed the divorce papers with visible contempt, making a show of it, his pen moving across the page with aggressive strokes that seemed designed to punctuate each point of his family's victory. He leaned back in his chair, looked directly at Alara, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I hope you understand that you're leaving with nothing. No name, no money, no future with this family. The child you're carrying means nothing to us." The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of pen on paper and the sound of Alara's breathing, steady and controlled despite the rage threatening to consume her. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded over her belly, and waited. Because beneath the grief and humiliation, beneath the exhaustion and fear, she felt something else stirring. A cold, patient certainty that this moment, this public degradation, would not be the end of her story. It would be the beginning of theirs. The judge was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human cruelty that could be packaged in legal documents and delivered with polite smiles. She sat behind the bench, reviewing the divorce papers with the methodical attention of someone who knew that the devil lived in detail, and the courtroom waited in a silence, so thick it felt like something solid, something that could be touched. Rowan leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man who believed he had already won, his signature still wet on the papers that would erase Alara from his life with the same casual efficiency one might use to cancel a subscription. Maribel sat behind him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. A queen watching her will be executed without opposition. Victoria and Celeste flanked her like attendants, their faces barely containing their triumph, already composing the social media posts they would write about this moment, the narrative they would craft about the desperate woman who had tried and failed to infiltrate their family. Alara sat alone at her table, her hands resting on her swollen belly, feeling her daughter kick as though in protest of the chaos surrounding them both. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple gray dress that was dignified without being expensive, professional without trying too hard. Her mother had wanted to come, had begged to be allowed in the courtroom, but Alara had refused. This was something she needed to face alone, something she needed to witness without distraction, because she understood that whatever happened in this room would define the rest of her life and her daughter's life, and she needed to remember every detail with perfect clarity. The exhaustion sat heavy in her bones, the grief for her father still fresh and raw, but beneath it all was something else, a strange calm, a quiet certainty that felt almost like faith, though she couldn't have explained what she had faith in. The judge looked up from the papers, her expression unreadable, and gestured to the clerk who sat to her right. "There's a sealed document that was filed this morning. Bring it forward." The clerk nodded, retrieved a manila envelope from a locked drawer, and carried it to the bench with the careful precision of someone handling evidence in a murder trial. The courtroom shifted, bodies leaning forward, whispers beginning, and then stopping as the judge raised one hand for silence. Maribel's serene expression flickered for just a moment, confusion passing across her face like a shadow, and Rowan sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what was happening. The judge opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, removed a document that looked official and dense with legal text, and began to read silently. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the tension in the room became unbearable, a pressure that made breathing difficult. Then the judge spoke, and her voice carried the weight of authority that comes from years of delivering verdicts that change lives. "Before we proceed with this divorce, there is a matter that must be addressed. A last will and testament has been submitted to this court, pertaining to the estate of Marcus Vance, father of Alara Vance, the respondent in these proceedings. The timing of this submission is legally sound, and the contents are relevant to the division of assets and the determination of spousal support." She paused, letting the words settle, and Alara felt her heart stop. Her father, the will her father had mentioned in passing years ago, the one he'd said she didn't need to worry about, the one she'd assumed was a formality covering the modest savings and the small house where her mother still lived. The judge continued, her tone measured, but with an edge of something that might have been surprising. "The deceased Marcus Vance has been identified through extensive documentation as the principal shareholder and silent partner in multiple corporations, including Vance Industries, Northern Tech Holdings, and Coastal Development Group." The words landed like grenades. Rowan's face went blank, his mouth opening slightly as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't remember how. Maribel's hands, so perfectly folded, clenched into fists, her knuckles going white. Victoria and Celeste turned to each other in synchronized shock, their expressions identical masks of disbelief. The judge kept reading, her voice steady, professional, delivering each fact with the precision of a surgeon making incisions. The estate is valued at approximately $3.7 billion, comprising liquid assets, real estate holdings, and controlling shares in 17 companies. She looked up from the document, her eyes finding Alara's across the courtroom. "Mrs. Vance is named as the sole heir. All assets, without exception, passed to her upon her father's death, which occurred 8 days ago." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The information was too massive to process immediately, too impossible to reconcile with the narrative the Hales had constructed about the worthless man from the worthless family who had raised a worthless daughter. Alara sat perfectly still, her face betraying nothing, though inside she felt something crack open, not surprise, because her father had told her months before his death, had sat her down one quiet afternoon and explained everything, had made her promise not to reveal it until the time was right. He had known, had seen how Hales treated her, had understood that the revelation would mean more if it came at the moment of her greatest humiliation. He had orchestrated this from beyond the grave, his final gift to the daughter he had called his little fighter. The judge continued, and now there was something almost like satisfaction in her tone, the subtle pleasure of someone who had presided over too many cases where the wealthy crushed the vulnerable, and was finally witnessing the scales balance. Furthermore, the documentation shows that 3 of the companies listed, Hale Manufacturing, Hale Textiles, and Hale International Shipping, are in fact subsidiaries of Vance Industries. The controlling shares that the Hale family believes they own are actually minority positions. The majority control rests with Vance Industries, which now belongs to Alara Vance. She let that sink in, watching as the full implications registered on the faces before her. In essence, Mrs. Vance now controls the companies that the Hale family's wealth and social standing depend upon. Maribel stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream. "This is impossible. This is some kind of fraud, some scheme she's concocted to. The judge cut her off with a look that could have frozen fire. Mrs. Hale, you will sit down and remain silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Maribel sat, but her composure was shattered, her face flushed with rage and something that looked like fear. Rowan hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, his eyes fixed on Alara as though seeing her for the first time. Victoria's hands were shaking, and Celeste had gone pale, the reality of what this meant crashing over them in waves they couldn't escape. The judge turned her attention back to Alara, and when she spoke, her voice was gentler. Mrs. Vance, given this new information, I must ask if you wish to proceed with the divorce as filed, or if you would like time to consult with legal counsel regarding the division of assets and other matters. Alara took a slow breath, feeling her daughter kick again, a reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. When she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, without a trace of the grief and humiliation she had carried into this room. I wish to proceed with the divorce, Your Honor. Immediately. On my terms. The judge nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Very well. Mr. Hale, you have signed papers indicating you wish to divorce Mrs. Vance and requesting that she leave with no financial support, no claim to the Hale family assets, and no rights regarding the surname for the child she is carrying. Is that correct? Rowan opened his mouth, closed it, looked to his mother for guidance that wasn't coming. Yes, but that was before you knew she was a billionaire. The judge finished for him. Yes, I imagine that does change things from your perspective. Unfortunately for you, a signature is a signature, and you've already agreed to these terms. She signed the divorce decree with efficient strokes, then looked up at Alara. Mrs. Vance, do you agree to these terms as stated by your former husband? That you will leave this marriage with no claim to Hale family assets, that your child will not carry the Hale surname, and that you request no financial support from Mr. Hale. Alara met Rowan's eyes across the courtroom, saw the panic there, the desperate realization that he had signed away any claim to the fortune he hadn't known existed, and she felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a cold clarity that felt like justice. Yes, Your Honor. I agree to every term exactly as stated. The judge brought down her gavel with a sound that echoed like thunder. The divorce is granted. Mrs. Vance, you are free to go. Alara stood slowly, her hand braced against the table for support, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. Then she steadied herself, picked up her purse, and walked toward the courtroom doors. Behind her, chaos erupted. Maribel's voice rising in fury, Victoria and Celeste talking over each other, Rowan calling her name with desperation she had once begged to hear, but now meant nothing. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge them, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing anything on her face except calm dignity. The bailiff held the door open for her, and as she passed through it, she heard the judge's voice one last time, addressing the Hales with a kind of cold contempt that can only come from someone with absolute authority. I suggest you retain very good lawyers. You're going to need them. Outside the courtroom, in the marble hallway, where Maribel had publicly humiliated her just an hour before, Alara stopped and pressed her hand against the wall, letting herself feel the weight of what had just happened. Her father had been a secret billionaire, a man who had lived modestly and deliberately, who had accumulated wealth through brilliant investments and patient strategy, while wearing second-hand clothes and driving a 15-year-old car. He had done it to protect his family from the very thing that had destroyed so many others, the corruption that came with visible wealth, the target it painted on your back, the way it changed how people saw you and treated you. He had kept his fortune hidden until the moment it could serve its highest purpose, which was protecting his daughter from people who measured worth in dollars and status instead of character and integrity. And now that fortune was hers. Not just the money, though that was staggering enough, but the power that came with it, the ability to make decisions that would ripple through companies and lives, the leverage to ensure that people like the Hales could never hurt anyone the way they had hurt her. She thought about her notebooks, the 3 volumes of documented cruelty she had kept hidden, and realized she might not need them after all. The truth had revealed itself in the most devastating way possible, not through her accusations, but through the cold facts of legal documents and corporate structures. The Hales had spent months trying to teach her that she was nothing, that she had no power, that she would always be at their mercy. And in one afternoon, in one reading of her father's will, all of that had been inverted, turned inside out, revealed as the lie it had always been. Alara walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt like absolution, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to smile. Not in triumph, not in cruelty, but in recognition of a simple truth her father had taught her as a child. That dignity couldn't be taken, only surrendered, and she had never surrendered hers. The battle was over, but the war, the long, patient, strategic war that would dismantle the Hale family's influence piece by piece, was just beginning. The courthouse doors closed behind Alara with a sound that felt final, absolute, like the sealing of a tomb or the closing of a chapter that could never be reopened. She stood on the steps for a moment, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the afternoon sun warm her face, and thinking about all the times she had dreamed of this freedom, and all the times she had wondered if she would survive long enough to claim it. Inside that building, behind those heavy doors, the Hale family was unraveling in real time, their carefully constructed world collapsing under the weight of a truth they had never seen coming. But Alara didn't look back. She had spent too many months looking back, analyzing every mistake, replaying every humiliation, searching for the moment where she could have changed the outcome. Now there was only forward, and forward meant taking control of an empire she hadn't asked for, but would wield with the precision her father had taught her. The first call came within an hour. Marcus Chun, her father's lawyer and the architect of the secret that had just detonated in that courtroom, reached her as she sat in her mother's living room trying to process the enormity of what had happened. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice warm but professional, "I imagine you have questions." Alara laughed, a sound that surprised her because she hadn't laughed in months, hadn't felt anything close to joy or relief or the strange lightness that was filling her chest now. That's one way to put it. Marcus had been the one who helped her father structure everything, who had ensured that every asset was protected, every loophole closed, every possible avenue of legal challenge eliminated before it could begin. Your father spent 30 years building this, and he spent the last 5 years making absolutely certain that when the time came, no one could take it from you. Not your husband, not his family, not anyone. Over the next week, Alara met with Marcus and his team of financial advisors, lawyers, and corporate strategists, people her father had trusted with pieces of the puzzle, but never the whole picture. They laid it out for her in conference rooms that smelled like leather and ambition, showing her spreadsheets and ownership structures, and chains of command that connected companies she'd never heard of to corporations everyone knew. Her father had been a genius at invisibility, at building wealth without drawing attention, at acquiring controlling interests in businesses while letting others believe they were in charge. Vance Industries didn't exist in public consciousness because it didn't need to. It operated through subsidiaries and shell companies and strategic partnerships that kept Marcus Vance's name off every letterhead and out of every business journal. But the control was absolute, the power undeniable. And now it all belonged to Alara. The Hale companies, Marcus explained during one of these meetings, pulling up documents on a screen that took up an entire wall, are particularly vulnerable. Your father acquired majority control 15 years ago when Hale Manufacturing was facing bankruptcy. He bailed them out quietly, restructured their debt, and took controlling shares as collateral. The Hales never knew because the acquisition was routed through 3 intermediary companies, and the quarterly dividends were small enough that they assumed they still owned everything. He paused, letting that sink in. They've been living on borrowed power for over a decade, and they never realized it. Alara stared at the documents, at the signatures and dates and legal language that spelled out exactly how completely her father had anticipated this moment. He knew, she said quietly. Even back then, he knew what kind of people they were. Marcus nodded. He did his research when Rowan started courting you. He didn't like what he found, but he also understood that you needed to make your own choices. So he prepared, just in case. The first move Alara made was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. She instructed her team to begin a comprehensive audit of all Hale-related companies, examining their financials, their leadership structures, and their vulnerabilities. It was framed as routine corporate oversight, the kind of thing that happened all the time when ownership changed hands. But Alara knew exactly what she was looking for. The places where the Hales had been careless, where they had cut corners, where their arrogance had led them to make decisions that looked fine on paper, but would crumble under scrutiny. Within 2 weeks, her team had compiled a report that was damning in its detail. Hale Manufacturing had been using substandard materials to cut costs, a decision that violated multiple safety regulations and opened them up to massive liability. Hale Textiles had been systematically underpaying workers, a practice that was technically legal, but morally indefensible and absolutely poisonous from a public relations standpoint. And Hale International Shipping had been avoiding environmental regulations through creative accounting that would look very bad if it ever became public. Alara didn't release any of this information. Not yet. Instead, she used it as leverage, quietly restructuring contracts, redirecting supply chains, and influencing executive appointments in ways that the Hales wouldn't notice immediately but would feel eventually. She replaced the CFO of Hale Manufacturing with someone loyal to her vision, someone who understood that cutting costs at the expense of safety was not acceptable. She brought in a new HR director at Hale Textiles who implemented fair wage policies that the previous leadership had resisted for years. And she installed environmental compliance officers at Hale International Shipping who had the authority to shut down operations that violated regulations, regardless of profit impact. Each change was presented as routine corporate modernization, efficiency improvements, responses to market pressures. But the cumulative effect was devastating to the Hales' ability to operate with a casual cruelty they had always taken for granted. Rowan was the first to feel the impact personally. He had been VP of Operations at Hale Manufacturing, a title his father had given him, and that he had held without actually doing much of anything for 5 years. Under the new structure Alara implemented, every executive was subject to performance reviews, measurable outcomes, accountability for results. Within a month, Rowan's inadequacy became impossible to hide. Projects stalled under his leadership. Decisions he made were questioned and often reversed, and the board, now stacked with people who answered to Alara's interests, began discussing whether he was the right person for the position. The conversations were professional, couched in corporate language, but the message was clear. Rowan Hale was being pushed out of his own family's company, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Maribel tried to intervene, calling an emergency board meeting and demanding explanations for the changes that were destroying her family's control. But the new board members listened politely, took notes, and then voted exactly as Alara's team had recommended. Mrs. Hale, the new chairman said, his voice respectful but firm, "We appreciate your family's history with these companies, but we have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, and the shareholders have made it clear that they expect modernization, transparency, and accountability. If the Hale family members currently in leadership positions can meet those standards, they'll remain. If they can't, we'll find people who can." Maribel had stared at him with the kind of rage that comes from realizing you've lost a war you didn't know you were fighting. "The shareholders," she said slowly, her voice shaking. "You mean Alara Vance?" The chairman smiled. "I mean the majority shareholder, yes." Victoria and Celeste faced their own reckonings in spaces beyond the boardroom. Their social influence, which had always seemed unassailable, began to erode as word spread about what had happened in the courthouse, about the secret billionaire father, about the way the Hales had treated Alara only to discover she held the keys to their entire empire. Invitations to exclusive events began drying up, not because Alara had blacklisted them. She didn't need to, but because people who dealt in power and status recognized a shift when they saw one, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of it. Former friends became distant. Allies became neutral. And the whisper network that had once amplified Victoria and Celeste's cruelty now turned against them, spreading stories about their treatment of Alara, their mockery of her father, their arrogance in assuming they would always be untouchable. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Alara's quiet dismantling was how invisible it remained to the broader public. There were no press releases, no dramatic announcements, no public confrontations. Everything happened behind closed doors, in boardrooms and legal offices, and private conversations where power shifted hands without witnesses. The Hales couldn't fight what they couldn't see, couldn't defend against accusations that were never made public, couldn't rally support when no one was quite sure what they needed support against. They just watched their world shrink, day by day, decision by decision, until the empire they thought they owned revealed itself to be a house built on land that had never belonged to them. 3 months after the courthouse revelation, Ilara gave birth to a daughter she named Grace, after her father's mother, a woman who had survived the Depression and taught Marcus Vance that dignity was something you carried inside yourself regardless of what the world tried to take. The delivery was smooth, the baby healthy, and Ilara held her daughter in the quiet of the hospital room and made promises she intended to keep. That Grace would grow up knowing her worth wasn't tied to anyone's approval, that kindness was strength not weakness, that patience was a weapon sharper than rage. The Hales sent flowers, an arrangement so expensive it looked like something meant for a funeral, with a card that Maribel had clearly agonized over, trying to strike a balance between congratulations and an attempt to rebuild bridges that Ilara had already burned to ash. Ilara read the card once, smiled at the transparent desperation in every word, and threw the whole arrangement in the trash. When she brought Grace home, it wasn't to the Hale estate, but to a new house she had purchased in a neighborhood that valued privacy over ostentation, a place with a garden where Grace could play and large windows that let in light, and a security system that ensured no one could enter unless Ilara invited them. Her mother moved in to help with the baby, and the two of them created a routine that felt nothing like the life Ilara had lived in the Hale mansion. There was laughter, spontaneity, warmth, the kind of ease that came from being around people who loved you without conditions or expectations. And at night, after Grace was asleep and her mother had retired to her room, Ilara would sit in the study her father had never lived to see and review reports from her team, making decisions that would shape companies and lives, wielding power with the restraint he had taught her. The Hales tried, repeatedly, to reach her. Rowan called, texted, showed up at her office building only to be turned away by security. Maribel sent letters, formal at first, and then increasingly desperate, asking for meetings, for conversations, for any opportunity to explain or apologize or negotiate. Victoria and Celeste attempted contact through mutual acquaintances, testing to see if there was any opening, any possibility of reconciliation. But Ilara responded to none of it. Not out of cruelty, though she would have been justified in that, but out of clarity. These were people who had shown her exactly who they were, who had taken every opportunity to humiliate and diminish her, who had laughed at her father's funeral and mocked her grief. Forgiveness might come someday, decades from now, when the wounds had scarred over, but reconciliation never would. She had no interest in letting them back into her life, no need for their apologies, no use for their regret. Instead, she focused on building something her father would have been proud of, a legacy not of wealth for its own sake, but of strategic influence used for good, companies run with integrity, employees treated with dignity, power exercised with restraint. She established scholarships for students from modest backgrounds, funded medical research, supported small businesses that the Hales' predatory practices had nearly destroyed. Every decision she made carried the weight of the lessons she had learned in that marble prison. Every act of generosity was informed by the months she had spent powerless and humiliated. And slowly, quietly, without fanfare or self-congratulation, Ilara Vance became exactly what the Hales had feared most, untouchable, not because of cruelty or domination, but because of competence, integrity, and the kind of patient strategic brilliance that her father had spent a lifetime cultivating and had passed to his daughter like a sacred trust. 6 months after the courtroom revelation, the full weight of Ilara's quiet dismantling began to show cracks in the Hale family's facade that even they could no longer ignore or explain away as temporary setbacks. Rowan lost his position at Hale Manufacturing on a Tuesday morning, the notification delivered by the new CEO in a conference room that still bore his grandfather's portrait on the wall, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on anyone present. "We appreciate your years of service," the CEO said, reading from a script that HR had prepared. "But the company is moving in a new direction that requires different leadership capabilities." Rowan had tried to argue, had pulled rank using a family name that no longer carried weight, had threatened legal action that his lawyer would later tell him was pointless. The controlling shares belonged to Vance Industries, which meant they belonged to Alara, which meant every decision that diminished him had been made with her silent approval. He left the building carrying a box of personal items that looked pathetic in his arms, and the security guard who escorted him out was someone he had once treated with casual contempt, a detail that made the humiliation complete. The financial impact hit next, systematic and devastating. The Hale family had lived for decades on dividends from companies they believed they owned, supplemented by salaries from executive positions they hadn't earned. But as Alara's restructuring continued, those income streams began to dry up. Dividends were reinvested into company improvements rather than distributed to shareholders. Executive salaries were adjusted to reflect actual performance, which meant most of the Hales saw their compensation cut by 60 or 70%. Properties that had been maintained through corporate expense accounts were suddenly subject to audits that revealed years of questionable charges, forcing the family to either pay back the money or justify expenses that couldn't be justified. The mansion where Alara had spent those terrible months began to feel less like a symbol of power and more like a financial anchor. Its maintenance costs bleeding money that was no longer flowing in at the rates they had taken for granted. Maribel tried to maintain appearances, hosting dinners and charity events with the same imperious confidence she had always wielded. But the cracks showed. The guest lists grew shorter as people found excuses not to attend, suddenly busy with conflicts that hadn't existed before. The conversations at these events became strained, full of careful politeness that barely masked the knowledge that everyone in the room understood the power dynamics had shifted. At one particularly awkward dinner, a woman Maribel had known for 30 years looked her directly in the eye and asked, "How does it feel, Maribel, to realize you spent all those years standing on someone else's foundation?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Maribel had no answer that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. Desperation dressed up as dignity. Victoria's social media empire, which had been built on her status as a Hale daughter and her ability to showcase a lifestyle of effortless wealth, began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Her followers, who had numbered in the hundreds of thousands, started asking pointed questions in the comments. "Is it true your family's wealth came from Alara's father?" one person wrote. "How does it feel to bully someone who was secretly richer than you the whole time?" asked another. Victoria tried to ignore them at first, then deleted the comments, then eventually made her account private, which only made things worse because it looked like retreat, like admission. Brand partnerships that had paid her tens of thousands of dollars to promote products dried up overnight. Companies suddenly deciding that her image was no longer aligned with our values, which was corporate speak for toxic. She tried reinventing herself, posting about personal growth and lessons learned, but her audience saw through it, calling out the performance, the hollow apologies that never quite admitted what she had done wrong. Celeste's experience was even more brutal because her entire identity had been wrapped up in being the clever one, the one who could destroy someone with a well-placed comment or a perfectly timed rumor. But cleverness without power is just noise, and as the Hale influence evaporated, Celeste discovered that the people she had counted as friends were really just contacts, relationships maintained not out of affection, but out of utility. She applied for positions at companies where her family name had once guaranteed interviews, only to receive polite rejections or, worse, no response at all. At one particularly devastating job interview, the hiring manager had looked at her resume and said with barely concealed satisfaction, "We're looking for candidates with actual experience, not just family connections." Celeste had walked out before the interview was over, her face burning with shame that felt like the universe delivering justice she hadn't believed in. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Hales' unraveling was how thoroughly Alara had anticipated every move they might make to fight back. When Rowan tried to sue for custody of Grace, claiming that Alara's wealth made her an unfit mother, an argument so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't so vicious, he discovered that Alara's legal team had already prepared for exactly this scenario. They presented the court with documentation of his abandonment, his cruelty during her pregnancy, and his family's treatment of her during the most vulnerable period of her life. The judge had looked at Rowan with something close to disgust and denied the motion before his lawyer could finish presenting his case. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, "you signed away all rights to this child in divorce proceedings that you initiated. You don't get to change your mind now that the financial circumstances have shifted in ways you didn't anticipate." When Maribel attempted to leverage old business relationships to damage Alara's reputation, spreading carefully crafted rumors about her competence and stability, she discovered that those relationships no longer existed in any meaningful way. The men who had once deferred to her opinions now returned her calls with polite distance, if they returned them at all. One former business partner, a man who had made millions through deals structured with Hale Company resources, was particularly blunt. "Maribel, I like you, I always have. But Alara Vance controls more wealth and influence than your entire family ever did, and she wields it with more intelligence and restraint than any of you ever showed. If I have to choose between maintaining a friendship with you and maintaining a business relationship with her, that's not really a choice at all." The conversation had ended there, and Maribel had sat in her study for 3 hours afterward, staring at the phone in her hand and realizing that the world she had navigated with such confidence for 60 years no longer existed. The psychological toll manifested in ways both predictable and surprising. Rowan began drinking, not socially, but methodically, purposefully, the kind of drinking that's designed to numb rather than celebrate. He would sit in the mansion's library, the room where he had once conducted business calls with casual authority, and work through bottles of scotch that cost more than most people's monthly rent, though he could barely afford them anymore. His sisters found him there one night, passed out in his father's old chair, and the sight of him, disheveled, diminished, pathetic, forced them to confront what they had become. "We did this," Victoria said quietly, though whether she meant they had brought it on themselves or they had destroyed their brother was unclear. Celeste didn't respond, just stood there looking at Rowan and seeing a future that terrified her. A cautionary tale about what happened when you built your entire identity on borrowed power and false superiority. Maribel's response was different, more controlled, but no less destructive. She began writing letters to Alara, long, rambling documents that started as attempts at reconciliation and gradually deteriorated into something that looked like confession. "I taught my children to value the wrong things," she wrote in one letter that Alara's assistant intercepted before it could reach her. "I taught them that power meant the ability to diminish others. That status was measured by how many people you could control or intimidate. I taught them cruelty disguised as strength, and now I watch them suffer the consequences of lessons I should never have taught." The letters went unanswered because Alara had made it clear that no contact from the Hales would be acknowledged or accepted, but Maribel kept writing them anyway, an exercise in futility that was really an exercise in delayed grief for the life she had lived and the damage she had caused. The broader social consequences rippled out in ways that surprised even Alara's team. The Hale family's treatment of her became a case study in business schools, an example of how arrogance and cruelty could destroy not just relationships, but entire fortunes. Articles appeared in business journals analyzing the strategic mistakes the Hales had made, the opportunities they had missed by focusing on social dominance rather than actual competence. One particularly cutting piece, published in a prestigious business magazine, was titled "The Cost of Cruelty: How the Hale Family Lost Everything by Underestimating the Wrong Woman." It detailed the timeline from Alara's marriage to the courthouse revelation to the systematic dismantling of their influence, and it ended with a question that became something of a cultural moment. In an age where information is power and underestimation is fatal, can families built on inherited wealth survive their own arrogance? The question resonated because it spoke to something larger than just the Hales' downfall. It spoke to a shift in how power was understood and wielded, a recognition that the old rules, where family names and social connections could insulate you from consequences, no longer applied in a world where competence, strategy, and moral clarity mattered more than pedigree. Alara became, almost against her will, a symbol of this shift, though she refused all interview requests and maintained a public profile, so low it was almost invisible. She let her actions speak, Let the results of her leadership in the companies she now controlled demonstrate her capabilities. Let the scholarships and charitable initiatives she funded show her values. And in doing so, she became more powerful than the Hales had ever been, because her power wasn't based on domination or intimidation, but on respect earned through competence and integrity. A year after the courthouse, Rowan made one final attempt at contact. He showed up at Alara's office building without an appointment, got past the lobby by lying to security, and made it as far as the elevator before being stopped. When Alara's head of security called to ask what she wanted done, she paused for a long moment, considering whether there was any value in hearing what Rowan had to say, any possibility that closure required confrontation. Then she remembered the courthouse hallway, the cruel words he had spoken while she was pregnant and grieving, the way he had signed those divorce papers with contempt, and she made her decision. "Remove him from the building," she said calmly. "And make sure he understands that if he tries this again, I'll pursue a restraining order." The message was delivered, and Rowan left without resistance. His shoulders slumped in defeat that looked like the final acceptance of consequences he had spent a year trying to avoid. That night, Alara sat in her study with Grace asleep upstairs and her mother reading in the next room, and she allowed herself a moment of reflection that she rarely indulged in. The Hales were broken, not because she had set out to destroy them, but because she had simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own actions. She had removed her support, withdrawn her patience, denied them access to the kindness they had taken for granted and abused. And in doing so, she had revealed that their power had always been an illusion, a structure built on foundations that didn't belong to them, maintained by the labor and grace of people they had treated as beneath them. The unraveling was complete, irreversible, and entirely self-inflicted. Alara had simply held up a mirror and forced them to see what they had always been. 2 years after the courthouse revelation, the distance between Alara's rising empire and the Hales' continued decline had grown so vast that they existed in entirely different worlds, separated not by geography, but by the unbridgeable gap between consequence and denial. Alara had expanded her father's companies with strategic acquisitions that business analysts called brilliant, investments in green technology and medical research that generated both profit and purpose, transforming Vance Industries from a hidden empire into a publicly acknowledged force that operated with transparency her father had never attempted. She appeared on magazine covers now, though reluctantly, always with Grace in the photos, because she refused to separate her identity as a business leader from her identity as a mother. The articles praised her vision, her ethics, her ability to wield enormous power without the corruption that usually came with it. But what they couldn't capture, what no interview or profile could articulate, was the cost of that power. The nights she still woke up remembering Maribel's laughter at her father's funeral, the phantom weight of humiliation that never quite left her body, the way her hands sometimes trembled when she signed documents that affected the Hales' remaining interests. The Hale mansion, that monument to inherited wealth and assumed superiority, went on the market 18 months after the divorce. The listing price was astronomical, reflective of what the family believed it was worth rather than what anyone would actually pay for a property that required millions in maintenance and came with the kind of reputation that made potential buyers uncomfortable. Months passed without serious offers. The price dropped, then dropped again. Each reduction a public admission of desperation that the society pages covered with thinly veiled satisfaction. When it finally sold, it was for 60% of the original asking price, to a tech entrepreneur who planned to gut the interior and rebuild it entirely, erasing every trace of the family that had lived there. Maribel signed the papers in a lawyer's office, her hands shaking so badly the notary had to wait, and when she walked out of that building she looked 10 years older than she had walked in. Rowan's trajectory was the most dramatic and the most pathetic. After losing his position at Hale Manufacturing, he had cycled through 3 jobs in 2 years, each one a step down from the last, each termination coming faster than the one before. The pattern was always the same. He would be hired based on his resume and family name, would spend a few months coasting on the assumption that his background meant competence, and would then be exposed as fundamentally unprepared for work that required actual skill rather than inherited authority. His drinking, which had started as a coping mechanism, became a defining characteristic, the thing colleagues and former friends mentioned first when his name came up. Rowan? Yeah, I heard he's struggling. Drinks too much, can't hold a job, basically living off what's left of the family money, which isn't much anymore. The pity in their voices was worse than contempt would have been, because pity meant they no longer saw him as a threat or even a peer, just a cautionary tale about what happened when privilege met reality. He tried, several times over those 2 years, to see grace. Not through legal channels, which his lawyer had explained were closed to him permanently, but through desperate, poorly thought-out attempts that security cameras captured and Alara's team documented for potential restraining orders. He showed up at Grace's preschool once, trying to convince the staff he was the father and had a right to pick her up, not understanding or not caring that his name wasn't on any authorized list, and that his parental rights had been voluntarily terminated in the divorce he had initiated. The school called the police, who escorted him away with warnings about harassment and trespassing. Another time, he waited outside Alara's office building for 6 hours, hoping to catch her leaving, planning some conversation he had rehearsed in his mind where he would finally make her understand how sorry he was, how he had been manipulated by his mother, how he wanted to be part of his daughter's life. But Alara never used the front entrance, and Rowan went home that night without seeing her, his apology undelivered and increasingly irrelevant. Victoria's decline was quieter, but no less complete. She had tried reinventing herself as a lifestyle influencer focused on authentic living and overcoming privilege, a pivot so transparently calculated that her remaining followers abandoned her in waves. The final straw came when someone leaked screenshots of her old messages, the cruel things she had said about Alara in private group chats, the mockery of her pregnancy, the jokes about her father's death. The screenshots went viral, and Victoria went from has-been influencer to actively canceled in the span of 48 hours. Brands that had been considering working with her withdrew their offers, speaking engagements were canceled, and the carefully constructed second act she had planned evaporated before it could begin. She moved out of the city eventually, to a small town where no one knew her name or cared about her family's fall from grace, and got a job managing a boutique clothing store, the kind of work she would have mocked as beneath her 3 years earlier. The job paid $30,000 a year, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, and the humiliation of it, the daily reminder that she was ordinary, replaceable, unremarkable, ate at her in ways that therapy and antidepressants couldn't quite address. Celeste's response to the family's collapse was to distance herself from it entirely, changing her last name legally and moving across the country to start over where her history wasn't common knowledge. She found work in marketing for a mid-sized firm, kept her head down, performed adequately but not exceptionally, and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with the Hales or their legacy. But the past had a way of finding you. And when a coworker discovered her real identity through some casual internet searching, the whispers started, the sideways glances, the knowledge that everyone knew who she had been and what her family had done. She lasted 6 months at that job before quitting, then another 8 months at the next one, each departure coming faster as the pattern repeated. Eventually, she stopped trying to hide, stopped changing her name back, stopped pretending she could outrun the reputation she had helped create. She worked contract jobs now, temporary positions that didn't require references or background checks, living in a studio apartment that smelled like old carpet and regret, wondering how her life had become when she had been born with every advantage. Maribel's decline was the slowest, and in some ways the cruelest, because she remained fully aware throughout it, unable to retreat into denial or substance abuse or geographical distance. She watched her children suffer consequences she had taught them to create, watched the empire she had married into crumble, watched her social circle shrink to nothing as friends revealed themselves to be acquaintances and acquaintances revealed themselves to be opportunists who had no use for her once she stopped being useful. She developed insomnia, lying awake in the modest apartment she had moved to after the mansion sold, replaying moments from the past and understanding too late the damage she had done. The worst nights were the ones where she remembered specific things she had said to Alara, the casual cruelty delivered with a smile, the public humiliations framed as corrections, the laughter at the funeral of a man who had turned out to be worth more in every measurable way than anyone in her family. The memories played like a prosecution, each one evidence of guilt she couldn't dispute. She wrote more letters during those sleepless nights, though she knew they would never be read. Some were addressed to Alara, attempting apologies that always fell short, because how do you apologize for systematic cruelty, for teaching your children that power meant the right to diminish others, for laughing at a funeral? Other letters were addressed to her children, trying to explain or justify or contextualize the lessons she had taught them, though she knew there was no justification that made those lessons right. And some letters were addressed to herself or to the woman she had been at 30 or 40, warning her about the costs of cruelty, the compound interest on moral bankruptcy, the way power without wisdom eventually consumed itself. She never sent any of the letters, just kept them in a box under her bed, a growing archive of regret that changed nothing and helped no one, but gave her something to do with the guilt that made sleep impossible. The broader social reckoning continued in ways that surprised everyone who remembered how untouchable the Hales had seemed just a few years earlier. A documentary crew approached Alara about telling her story, offering creative control and promising that the focus would be on resilience and strategy rather than revenge. She declined politely but firmly, explaining that her life wasn't a morality tale to be packaged for consumption, that Grace deserved to grow up without her mother's trauma being entertainment. But the documentary got made anyway, with interviews from former Hale employees, business analysts, and people who had witnessed the family's treatment of Alara firsthand. It was titled The Fall of House Hale, and it painted a portrait of systematic cruelty, unchecked privilege, and the inevitable collapse that came when moral bankruptcy met strategic incompetence. The Hales refused to participate, which made the documentary more damning because their silence looked like admission, like they had no defense to offer against accusations that were simply true. Rowan watched the documentary alone in his apartment, drinking through most of it, pausing occasionally when his own face appeared on screen. Old photos from society events, footage from the courthouse, interviews with people who described him as weak, cruel, complicit. He saw himself through others' eyes and recognized that they were right, that he had been all of those things, that his attempts at redemption were too late and too selfish to matter. When the documentary ended, he sat in the dark for an hour, then picked up his phone and typed out a message to Alara that he had written and deleted 100 times before. I know you'll never read this. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I just need you to know that I understand now what I did, what we all did, and that I'm sorry. Not because I want anything from you, but because you deserve to hear it even if you don't care. He stared at the message for 10 minutes, his thumb hovering over the send button, then deleted it like he had deleted all the others, because he understood that apologies without consequences were just more noise, and Alara had heard enough noise from him to last a lifetime. 3 years after the courthouse, on Grace's 3rd birthday, Alara threw a party in her backyard, surrounded by friends she had rebuilt relationships with and new friends who knew her as she was now rather than as she had been. Grace ran through the grass in a yellow dress, her laughter carrying across the yard, and Alara watched her with the kind of fierce, protective love that came from knowing exactly what the world could do to vulnerable people. Her mother sat beside her, now in her 70s, but sharp and present, and they didn't need to speak to communicate the shared understanding that this moment, this simple, joyful moment, was the victory that mattered. Not the corporate conquests, not the Hale's destruction, not the wealth or power or vindication, but this, a child growing up surrounded by love, learning lessons about dignity and kindness and the difference between power and cruelty. This was what Alara's father had worked for in secret, what he had protected and planned for, what he had died knowing would come to pass. And as Grace blew out her candles and made a wish that only 3-year-olds believe comes true, Alara felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Peace. Not because the war was over, because wars with consequences that never fully end, but because she had won the only battle that ever mattered, which was the fight to remain herself despite everything that had been done to her. 5 years after the courthouse revelation, Alara Vance had become something her father would have recognized immediately. A quiet force that shaped industries without dominating headlines. A billionaire who wielded influence through competence rather than spectacle. Grace was in kindergarten now, a bright child with her grandfather's sharp mind and her mother's careful empathy, unaware of the war that had been fought to protect her existence. The house they lived in had grown from a sanctuary into something more complex, a home where laughter lived alongside the memory of what it had cost to build it, where security cameras and careful vetting of every visitor reminded Alara that safety was something you maintained, not something you assumed. Her mother had aged into her 70s with a kind of grace that came from surviving loss and watching justice arrive slowly. And on Sunday mornings the three of them would sit in the garden while Grace asked questions about her grandfather, the man she had never met, but whose presence shaped every decision Alara made. The Hale family, by contrast, had settled into a kind of permanent diminishment that no longer shocked anyone who remembered their former status. They had become a cautionary tale, the kind of story people told at business dinners to illustrate the dangers of arrogance, the inevitability of consequence, the way privilege, without competence, eventually consumed itself. Rowan had stopped trying to rebuild, stopped applying for positions that required references he couldn't provide or explanations for gaps in employment that revealed too much. He worked now in insurance sales, a job that required nothing but persistence and the ability to tolerate rejection, making enough to cover rent on a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood he would have mocked a decade ago. His drinking had stabilized at a level that was functional but not healthy, a controlled destruction that would take years to kill him, but was killing him nonetheless. He thought about Grace constantly, the daughter he had signed away in a moment of contempt that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand or justify or simply survive. Victoria had found something resembling stability in her anonymity, though calling it stability was generous. She managed a boutique with competence born from necessity, had learned to smile at customers who treated her like help rather than an equal, had grown accustomed to paychecks that covered bills but left nothing for savings or luxuries. She was 34 and looked older, the stress of downward mobility etched into lines around her eyes that expensive creams could no longer afford to address. Sometimes former friends from her old life would walk into the store, not recognizing her immediately, and Victoria would have to make the choice, acknowledge who she was and watch them process the fall, or stay silent and serve them like any other customer. She usually chose silence because it hurt less, because explanations required energy she didn't have, because what was there to say that wouldn't sound like begging for pity she didn't deserve. Celeste had married desperately and poorly, to a man who offered stability in exchange for her settling for a life that felt nothing like the future she had imagined. He was kind but unremarkable, worked in accounting, had no ambition beyond comfort and routine. They lived in a suburb that all looked the same, where neighbors knew each other's names but not their histories, where Celeste could pretend to be someone who had always been ordinary. She had a son now 2 years old, and she looked at him sometimes with a terror that kept her awake at night, the fear that she would teach him the wrong lessons, that cruelty was hereditary, that the poison her mother had passed to her would somehow infect another generation. She tried to be different, tried to model kindness and humility, but she caught herself sometimes making the kind of cutting remarks that had once been her specialty, and the horror of recognizing her mother's voice coming out of her mouth made her wonder if change was possible, or if she was just performing contrition while remaining fundamentally the same. Maribel's decline had reached a kind of equilibrium that looked from the outside like acceptance, but felt from the inside like slow suffocation. She lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment paid for by what remained of the family money, which wasn't much, and was shrinking every year as medical bills and basic expenses consumed what her husband's life insurance hadn't covered. Her husband had died 3 years after the courthouse, a heart attack that the doctors said was stress-related, that Maribel knew was grief-related. The accumulated weight of watching everything he had built reveal itself to be borrowed, and everything he had believed about his family reveal itself to be delusion. She had nursed him through those final months, watching him fade not from disease, but from the understanding that his legacy was ruined, that his children were broken, that the empire he thought he was leaving them was actually someone else's property that they had been allowed to manage until the real owner decided otherwise. The isolation was what hurt most. Maribel had spent 60 years cultivating relationships she thought were friendships, hosting events she believed mattered, wielding influence she assumed was hers by right. But when the power evaporated, so did the relationships, and she discovered that she had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who had never actually liked her, who had tolerated her because it was useful or profitable or socially necessary. The silence of her phone, once constantly ringing with invitations and gossip and requests for her opinion, had become the soundtrack of her life. She filled the quiet with television and books, and the kind of small routines that gave structure to days that otherwise had no purpose. And she thought about Alara constantly, not with the hatred or resentment one might expect, but with something closer to awe. The recognition that the woman she had tried to destroy had possessed reserves of strength and strategic intelligence that Maribel, for all her confidence, had never imagined existed. The letters continued, though less frequently now, written on nights when the insomnia was particularly bad and the need to confess became overwhelming. I taught my children that power was the ability to make others feel small, she wrote in one letter dated 3 months before Grace's 5th birthday. I taught them that status was measured by how much discomfort you could cause without consequence. I taught them cruelty and called it strength, manipulation and called it intelligence, arrogance and called it confidence. And now I watch them pay prices I should have paid, suffer consequences I earned but they inherited. How do I apologize for that? How do I tell them I was wrong about everything when admitting that means admitting I destroyed their lives with lessons that felt like love at the time? The letter, like all the others, went into the box under her bed, unread by anyone. A confession without an audience that changed nothing but gave her something to do with guilt that had become her constant companion. One afternoon in late autumn, Alara received a call from her head of security that Rowan had been found unconscious outside her office building. Not threatening, not trying to force entry, just sitting on a bench across the street where he apparently spent several hours a week watching people enter and exit, hoping for a glimpse of her or Grace even though he knew neither would appear. He had collapsed from dehydration and exhaustion, the security footage showing him swaying before falling, and someone had called an ambulance. The hospital contacted Alara because her name was in his phone under emergency contacts, a detail that broke her heart in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. She sat in her office for 20 minutes after the call, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of a choice she knew would define something important. Then she called her lawyer and instructed him to ensure Rowan's medical bills were paid anonymously, that he was stabilized and released, and that he was informed by hospital staff that he needed to stop sitting outside the building or the police would be called. Not cruelty, not kindness, just the practical response of someone who had learned that mercy didn't require reconciliation. When Grace turned 5, Alara took her to visit her grandfather's grave for the first time. They stood together in the cemetery where Marcus Vance was buried under a modest headstone that gave no indication of the empire he had built or the strategic genius that had protected his daughter when she needed it most. Grace asked questions the way 5-year-olds do, innocent and direct, and Alara answered them honestly, explaining that her grandfather had been a man who believed that dignity was something you carried inside yourself regardless of what the world tried to take, that patience was power, that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage if you were smart enough to use it. Did he love us? Grace asked, and Alara felt tears she hadn't expected burn behind her eyes. More than anything. Everything he did, every choice he made, was to protect us. To make sure we would be safe, strong, and free. Grace nodded seriously, processing this in whatever way children process the weight of love that spans generations. Then placed the flowers they had brought on the grave with the careful reverence of someone performing a ritual she understood mattered even if she didn't fully understand why. That night, after Grace was asleep and her mother had gone to bed, Alara sat in her study and did something she had avoided for 5 years. She allowed herself to think about what-ifs and alternate timelines, the versions of this story where different choices had led to different outcomes. What if Rowan had defended her that first dinner? What if Maribel had shown her kindness instead of contempt? What if the Hales had recognized that wealth without character was hollow, that status without integrity was fragile, that cruelty always carried costs even if those costs took years to arrive? Would they still be whole? Would she still be married? Would Grace know her father's name as something other than a cautionary tale? The questions had no answers, or rather they had too many answers, all of them hypothetical, all of them irrelevant to the reality she actually inhabited. But asking them felt necessary somehow, a ritual of acknowledgement that the war hadn't been inevitable, that people were capable of change if they chose it, that tragedy was often just a series of small cruelties compounded by arrogance until the weight became unbearable. She thought about forgiveness, a concept that had become complicated over the years. Part of her had forgiven the Hales in the sense that she no longer actively wished them harm, no longer spent energy on anger that would have poisoned her more than them. But forgiveness without reconciliation was a strange half-measure, acknowledgement that what they had done was forgivable in theory while maintaining absolute boundaries against allowing them back into her life in practice. Could you forgive someone while simultaneously ensuring they never got close enough to hurt you again? The question felt philosophical, the kind of thing she might have discussed with her father if he had lived to see how his plan had unfolded, if he could have explained the difference between justice and vengeance, mercy and weakness, forgiveness and foolishness. She suspected he would have told her that she was overthinking it, that the answer was simple. She owed them nothing, not even her anger. And the best revenge was the life she was building with grace, the empire she was running with integrity, the future she was creating that had nothing to do with them at all. The 5-year anniversary of the courthouse revelation came and went without ceremony or acknowledgement, a date that mattered only to those who remembered and those who were still paying its costs. Alara marked it privately by reviewing the corporate reports from the companies she now controlled, noting with satisfaction that employee satisfaction was up, that safety violations were down, that profits were growing without compromising the values her father had instilled in her. The Hales marked it in their own ways. Rowan by drinking until he passed out, Victoria by working a double shift to avoid being alone with her thoughts, Celeste by holding her son a little tighter and promising herself she would be better than her mother had been, Maribel by writing another letter she would never send and adding it to the box that had grown too full to close properly. And somewhere in the space between triumph and tragedy, justice and cruelty, power and mercy, the truth settled into its final form, that consequences were patient but inevitable, that character mattered more than status, and that the woman who had been dismissed as worthless by people who measured worth in the wrong currencies had proven herself worth more than all of them combined, not through cruelty or domination, but through the quiet accumulation of dignity they had tried and failed to destroy. 10 years after the courthouse revelation, Alara Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office overlooking the city, watching the sunset paint the skyline in shades of amber and gold, and felt the strange weight of a story that had finally reached its natural conclusion. Grace was 10 now, thriving in a private school that valued character as much as achievement, a child who knew nothing of the cruelty that had preceded her birth except in the abstract way children understand that their parents' lives contained chapters they weren't part of. Her mother had passed away 2 years earlier, peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a legacy of quiet strength that Alara tried to honor in every decision she made. The empire her father had built and she had expanded now employed over 50,000 people across 3 continents, generated billions in revenue, and operated with an ethical framework that had become a model for other companies trying to balance profit with responsibility. She had done what she set out to do, not just survive the Hales' cruelty, but transform it into something that mattered, something that would outlast all of them. The Hale family had faded into obscurity, so complete it felt almost like erasure, their names appearing in search results only in connection with business school case studies about the dangers of inherited privilege and moral bankruptcy. Rowan had died 3 years earlier, his liver finally giving out after a decade of systematic self-destruction that everyone who knew him had seen coming, but no one had been able to prevent. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of former colleagues, who came out of obligation rather than grief, and neither Alara nor Grace was present, their absence noted but not commented on, because everyone understood that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt even by death. Victoria heard about her brother's death through a phone call from Celeste, and she had cried for 3 days, not for the man Rowan had become, but for the brother he had been before their mother's poison had twisted him into something unrecognizable. She still worked at the boutique, had been promoted to assistant manager, a title that carried slightly more responsibility and slightly more money, but no actual power or prestige. She was 41 and looked 50, the accumulated stress of downward mobility having aged her in ways that felt both unjust and completely deserved. Celeste had moved again, this time to a different state entirely, trying once more to outrun a past that followed her like a shadow regardless of how many miles she put between herself and the life she used to live. Her son was 7 now, a quiet child who asked questions she didn't know how to answer about why they never visited grandmother Maribel, why his cousins didn't exist, why their family seemed smaller and sadder than the families of his friends. She tried to be honest with him in age-appropriate ways, explaining that sometimes people make mistakes that have consequences that last longer than the mistakes themselves, that family wasn't always defined by blood, that love required more than just biology. But the conversations exhausted her because they required her to confront truths she had spent years trying to avoid, that she had been complicit in cruelty, that her children would inherit the reputation she had earned, that redemption might not be possible no matter how hard she tried or how much she changed. She worked as a consultant now, doing freelance projects that allowed her to avoid long-term employment, where background checks and references might expose who she really was, making enough to survive, but never enough to feel secure. Maribel had outlived her husband by 7 years and her son by 3, each death stripping away another piece of the identity she had built over decades, until all that remained was a woman in her 70s living alone in an apartment that smelled like old books and regret. Her health had deteriorated in the way health does when you stop caring whether you live or die, a series of small declines that added up to significant disability, arthritis that made writing painful, cataracts that made reading difficult, a heart condition that required medication she sometimes forgot to take because forgetting felt easier than remembering why she needed to stay alive. She thought about Alara every day, not with hope of reconciliation, because she understood that ship had sailed and sunk and would never be recovered, but with a kind of morbid fascination about what the woman she had tried to destroy had become. She followed the business news when she could, reading articles about Vance Industries' latest acquisitions or charitable initiatives, and each article was a reminder that Alara had won not just the battle but the war, not just the revenge but the moral high ground, not just a fortune but the legacy that would outlast all of them. The letters had stopped years ago, not because Maribel had run out of things to say, but because she had finally accepted that saying them changed nothing. The box under her bed contained over 200 letters now, a decade of confession and regret and attempted explanation that no one would ever read, because the only person they were addressed to had made it clear that she had no interest in Maribel's guilt or apologies or attempts at redemption. Sometimes, late at night when insomnia was particularly bad, Maribel would pull out the box and read through old letters, seeing her own handwriting deteriorate over the years from precise and controlled to shaky and desperate, watching the evolution of her understanding from defensive justification to reluctant acknowledgement to something that looked like genuine remorse, but arrived too late to matter. The exercise was masochistic, a form of self-punishment that she engaged in because punishment felt like the only appropriate response to what she had done, the only way to acknowledge the magnitude of her failures, even if no one was watching or keeping score. One morning in early spring, Maribel received a package that had no return address, but bore the logo of a law firm she didn't recognize. Inside was a letter and a check, both typed with the formal precision of legal documents. The letter explained that an anonymous benefactor had established a fund to ensure that Maribel's remaining medical expenses would be covered, that her rent would be paid for the duration of her life, and that she would have a modest monthly stipend to cover food and basic necessities. The check represented the first installment, enough money to stabilize her immediate financial crisis, but not enough to restore anything resembling her former lifestyle. There was no message, no explanation beyond the legal language, no indication of who had arranged this or why. But Maribel knew. She knew the way you know things that are too obvious to require confirmation, knew with a certainty that made her hands shake and her eyes burn with tears she hadn't cried in years. Alara had done this. Not out of forgiveness, not out of reconciliation, but out of something that looked like mercy, even though it felt like the cruelest kindness imaginable. The acknowledgement that Maribel was suffering, and that suffering, even deserved suffering, had limits that a person with power and resources could choose to address. Maribel sat in her apartment for 3 hours after opening that package, the letter and check spread on the table in front of her, trying to understand what response was appropriate or possible. Gratitude felt wrong, because accepting mercy from someone you had tried to destroy felt like compounding the original sin. Refusal felt equally wrong, because pride had been the foundation of her worst decisions, and maintaining pride now would be repeating the same mistakes. Eventually, she did nothing, kept the check, cashed it when her bills came due, and added this act of inexplicable mercy to the growing list of things she didn't understand about the woman whose life she had tried to make unbearable. It was the last direct contact, however indirect, that she would ever have with Alara Vance, and in some ways that made it worse. The understanding that even this small kindness came with a clear message that it was final, that no reconciliation would follow, that Alara had decided Maribel's basic survival was worth ensuring, but her presence in Alara's life was not. Grace learned about her father on her 10th birthday, not because Alara had been keeping it secret, but because the question had never come up in ways that required detailed answers. They were sitting in the garden, just the two of them, eating birthday cake and watching birds in the fountain her grandfather had installed before Grace was born, when Grace asked with the casual directness of children who don't yet understand that some questions carry weight, "Mom, why don't I have a dad like other kids?" Alara had prepared for this conversation for years, had rehearsed different versions depending on Grace's age and maturity, but now that it was happening, she found herself improvising, speaking from instinct rather than script. "You had a dad, sweetheart. His name was Rowan. He and I got divorced before you were born, and he made a choice not to be part of your life. That was his choice, not yours, and it says nothing about your worth or value." Grace absorbed this with the seriousness of someone processing information that changes how they understand their own story. Was he a bad person? The question was simple, but the answer was complicated, and Alara took a moment to find words that were honest, without being cruel. He was a person who made bad choices and never learned how to make better ones. "He hurt me, and he hurt other people, but I don't think he was evil. I think he was weak, and he let weak people around him make him weaker." Grace nodded slowly. "Do I look like him?" Alara studied her daughter's face, seeing traces of Rowan in the shape of her eyes and the line of her jaw, but seeing more of herself and her father, the strength that came from surviving, and the kindness that came from choosing not to repeat the cruelty that had been inflicted on you. "A little, but mostly you look like yourself. And that's exactly who you should be." The conversation continued for another hour, Grace asking questions and Alara answering them with the careful honesty of someone who understood that children deserve truth, but also deserve protection, that knowledge was power, but ignorance could be mercy, that the line between those things was something you navigated based on instinct and love rather than rules. When it was over, Grace hugged her mother with the fierce intensity of someone who had just learned something important about the world and needed physical reassurance that the ground was still solid beneath her feet. "I'm glad you're my mom," she said, her voice muffled against Alara's shoulder. "I'm glad I'm here with you and not with people who hurt you." Alara held her daughter and felt something shift inside her chest, a release of tension she hadn't known she was carrying, the understanding that Grace would be okay, that the cycle of cruelty that had defined the Hales wouldn't touch her daughter, that the legacy she was building was stronger than the poison that had come before it. That night, alone in her study after Grace had gone to bed, Alara did something she had avoided for a decade. She went through the 3 notebooks where she had documented every slight, every insult, every calculated act of cruelty the Hales had inflicted during those terrible months. She read through them slowly, remembering the woman she had been when she wrote these entries, the desperation and fear and rage that had filled her as she recorded evidence she didn't know if she would ever use. Then she carried the notebooks to the fireplace, lit a fire that she didn't need because the night was warm, and burned them 1 page at a time, watching the documentation of her humiliation transform into ash and smoke. She didn't need them anymore. The evidence had served its purpose. The battle had been fought and won. And holding onto the detailed record of what had been done to her felt less like justice, and more like choosing to remain trapped in a past that no longer had power over her present. The fire burned for an hour, consuming years of documented cruelty, and when it finally died down, Alara felt lighter, freer, as though she had just burned the last chains that connected her to the Hales and the suffering they had caused. The final chapter of this story, if stories ever truly end, came 5 years later when Grace was 15 and Alara received word that Maribel Hale had died, alone in her apartment, discovered 3 days after the fact by a neighbor who noticed the smell. There was no funeral, no service, no gathering to remember a woman whose family had scattered and whose friends had abandoned her years before. Alara heard about it through her lawyer, who had been quietly monitoring the situation because legal loose ends sometimes required attention even decades after the original conflict. He asked if she wanted to handle any arrangements, if there were debts or responsibilities that needed addressing, and Alara said no with a finality that surprised neither of them. She had ensured Maribel's survival for the last years of her life, had provided the basic dignity of shelter and food and medical care, but that was the extent of mercy she was willing or able to offer. The rest, the funeral, the estate, the final accounting of a life lived badly, was not her responsibility, not her burden, not her concern. That evening, Alara told Grace about Maribel's death, framing it as closure rather than tragedy, the end of a chapter that had defined too much of their lives for too long. Grace listened with the mature attention of a teenager who understood that adult relationships were complicated, and that some stories didn't have satisfying endings, just endings. "Are you sad?" she asked, and Alara considered the question carefully before answering. "No, I'm relieved. Not because she's dead, but because her death means that part of my life is finally, completely over. There's no possibility of unexpected contact, no chance of future complications, no loose ends that might unravel. It's done." Grace nodded, accepting this with the wisdom of someone raised by a mother who had taught her that honesty was more valuable than comfortable lies. "Then I'm relieved too," she said simply, and they sat together in silence that felt like peace, watching the sun set on a story that had taken 15 years to reach its conclusion, but had finally, irrevocably, ended. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to hit the subscribe button and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most.